Hi, this is a history of ancient philosophy. I'm Mark Thorsby, and this video we'll be talking about Plato's Meno dialogue. So welcome everyone, I hope you guys are doing well. Let me begin by taking a look at, or at least reviewing, a little bit of the background information related to this dialogue. First and foremost, this dialogue, scholars believe, comes from what is known as Plato's middle period. As I've mentioned in previous videos, Plato's work is roughly divided into early, middle, and late periods. The early period signifies if you will, the least developed philosophical discussions in Plato's work, but ones which primarily are representative of the historical Socrates, the Socrates we think actually lived. In the middle dialogue, we see the development of Plato's famous theory of the forms. We'll be covering the theory of the forms in much greater detail in subsequent videos here, but the theory of the forms is essentially Plato's primary metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical theory. It's a coherent system of explanations related to how we can gain knowledge and what it means about reality and how we ought to live. And so this is one of the Meno dialogue here is probably a transitional dialogue between the Socrates we see in the Apology and the Socrates we see in the Republic. We'll see that a lot of the key themes from the Republic are present in the Meno dialogue, except that the sort of explanation and the description of the forms, if you will, is incomplete within the Meno. In fact, the dialogue ends, from my perspective, in a sort of unsatisfactory way, where it looks like the discussion of what virtue is ends in a sort of stalemate or a shrug of the shoulders when Socrates suggests that it's somehow a divine gift. So it's a very sort of interesting dialogue, and I think it's a great dialogue to read and to really read thoroughly as you begin to learn and understand Plato's primary theory. Now, there's a lot of different themes that Plato talks about, and there's a lot of things that get discussed in this dialogue. Of course, I can't go over all of them, but we can say that the sort of key Platonic themes that are addressed is first is virtue. The question of what virtue is actually the organizing principle for the entire dialogue. That's the subject itself. But this quickly leads into a question of what knowledge consists in, and ultimately we see Plato suggesting what's known as the theory of recollection in order to solve what Plato calls the debater's argument, or later on this sort of paradox of knowledge. And so we're going to take a look at that today. There's a lot of interesting nuances in the dialogue as well, especially when you consider that Plato's playing around, because there's a lot of different characters and places that are referenced in this dialogue, and Plato is, I think, making sort of unknown to the modern reader, Plato is referencing really highly charged and well-known individuals to the Athenian people. And by doing so, he's making politically ironic points about virtue. We'll see that the dialogue here is between Socrates, Meno, and Anytus. These are the primary characters within the dialogue. Now, Socrates and Meno, they're the ones who are the primary characters in the sense that their discussion goes back and forth. Anytus comes here at the end. Now, it'll be interesting here because Meno and Anytus ultimately will not eventually come to have very good reputations among the Athenian people, but Socrates will. But while this dialogue is taking place, Meno and Anytus are sort of at the height of their public celebrity, if you will, and they are fairly well known. But there's lots of debate about how the Athenian people may have interpreted this sort of dialogue. Some of the other people that are mentioned in the dialogue who are very important is Gorgias. And Gorgias we mentioned in a previous video here as he's a famous sophist, and he's actually the teacher of Meno. And we'll see pretty quickly that Socrates wants to dispense with all things Gorgias and rather pursue the question of what virtue is with Meno throughout the dialogue. Prodicus is also mentioned. Prodicus is Socrates' teacher. Pericles, Lysimachus, and Themistocles, all of these people are mentioned with regard to their discussion with Anytus, because they're discussing all of these, Pericles and all these other guys here. These are all well-known Athenians who have a good, high reputation for being virtuous. But we'll see that in the dialogue here, Socrates suggests that virtue doesn't appear to be something that can be taught, because even though Pericles, Lysimachus, and Themistocles were all virtuous people, famously their children were not, their sons were not, and so it seems that if someone's virtuous, of course they would teach virtue to their own children, but these guys couldn't do it, so it doesn't look like virtue can be taught. And Pericles, of course, is the most famous. Now, there's one other character who I didn't list here because he doesn't have a name, who's actually in the dialogue, and he is the slave boy, or the attendant, as some translations have it. And he plays he's an important character in the dialogue as well, but he's not anyone who's known, and he's probably purely fictional. Where are the places? This dialogue, as far as I understand, is taking place in Athens, but Thessaly and Larissa in particular are mentioned. So just to give you a sense of the geography here, here's where Athens is located, and up here is Thessaly is a region. And within Thessaly are multiple city-states or polises, and right here is where Larissa is located. So when these references take place, you can get a sense, because there's a distinction Plato makes, a differentiation between Thessaly and Athens, that is symbolic of the distinction between Socrates and Meno, between knowledge and ignorance. And so Plato, as he typically does here, is using characters and places as a way to symbolically gesture towards the conceptual distinctions that actually get discussed in the dialogue. Now, if we're going to give an overview of the dialogue in general, we can say that the dialogue consists of these sorts of 5 key moments. The first key moment is just when the main question emerges, which is, can virtue be taught? And this really is an important question. Consider the fact that, one moment here, my apologies, I got interrupted there by a text. But this question of whether or not virtue can be taught is really important. Consider the fact that a lot of times when people say, why is it that we have public education? The idea is that if people can become educated in our society, then hopefully they can live better lives and be better people and be good citizens. There's always a discussion here about the role of part of the purpose of education in the United States, for instance, is to help promote good civic engagement among the citizens. But of course that all assumes that we can teach this sort of thing. We can teach what it means to be a good citizen. And of course, being a good citizen seems to include within it this notion of a sort of activity of virtue. So our question first here is, can virtue be taught? And we'll see that this is the question that Meno is actually asking of Socrates. So that's another feature of the Middle Period dialogue that's different than the Euthyphro dialogue, for instance, which is namely in this dialogue we see that Socrates is going to be the one who's giving the answers rather than asking the questions, though he asks questions constantly, because that's an implicit element within the dialectical method or the Socratic method that he typically employs. The second sort of moment that's important is the question of what is the universal form of virtue, and that's because it takes a long time for Meno to understand what it is that the philosopher needs to, what sort of answer the philosopher has to give regarding this question of virtue. That is, how is it that we can gain essential knowledge of things? The third moment here is, well, how will virtue be recognized if neither Meno nor Socrates knows what it looks like? That is, if one is ignorant of something, how does one gain knowledge into that thing? This is what Plato will refer to here as the debater's argument, or we can call it paradox of knowledge. And this really raises an epistemological question, which is, how is it that we can gain knowledge of things? How is inquiry possible when you begin from a state of ignorance. Because consider, for instance, if you want to know what virtue is, then that means that you don't know what it is. But if you don't know what virtue is, then how are you ever going to recognize it when you see it, right? So it seems like you have virtue and you don't have virtue at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. What exactly does it mean to gain knowledge? And this goes with the question of whether or not virtue is itself a type of knowledge, given all of the beneficial effects that seem to occur or come along with living a virtuous life. Now, in order to address this question of what knowledge is, we see this argument that knowledge is a sort of recollection. And I put here it's the revelation of recollection, because at this point in the dialogue, or at this point in Plato's work, Socrates just suggests that someone else who's a priest or priestess told him this. So we don't really get a really good argument for where this, or we're not really told where this argument comes from, but we are presented with the argument that knowledge is a form of recollection. And to exemplify and demonstrate this, Plato actually then, or Socrates then, actually uses the slave boy or the attendant as an example of showing that people who really are ignorant of things like geometry can come to know geometry without being taught, it looks like. And when I say without being taught, surely by asking another person a series of questions, it looks like knowledge can be arrived at. So knowledge, again, isn't something you pour into a person. It looks like knowledge is something that is already within you. It's inborn or innate. So that, of course, leads finally to the final question, well, then can virtue be taught? And the answer looks like, at the end, that no, it can't be taught, or at least if it can be taught, it's unclear how or why. What I want to do now is, that's sort of a general gist of what's taking place in this dialogue, an overall framework to the dialogue. But let me sort of go through, what I want to do now is go through what I think are the key points within the dialogue and talk about them, beginning with the first part. And here I think we see that Plato draws an immediate contrast. So, for instance, Plato Meno asks at the very beginning here, he says, can virtue be taught? Can it be practiced? Is it possessed by one's own nature? And if not, what is it? How do you get it? Right? And that's an important question, especially if you yourself want to become virtuous. How is it possible? And Socrates responds immediately by saying, well, Meno, you're asking such a difficult question. You're from Thessaly here. And in Thessaly, where Gorgias is from, it looks like everyone has knowledge, and everyone's able to give an answer. In fact, he mentions Gorgias particularly and says, for instance, Gorgias can give an answer to every question. He says, but by contrast, in Athens, we don't have any knowledge. We're really in a state of ignorance. And we want to learn what virtue is, but we ourselves don't know what it is. So because we don't know what virtue is, we can't actually tell you if it can be taught or not. And so this is sort of a moment of Socratic irony, actually. It's Socratic irony in the sense that, of course, you can imagine that if Gorgias has an answer to every question, it likely means that those answers are not actually true. And, of course, by contrast, Socrates, who doesn't have the answer, actually has a greater knowledge of what he's talking about. Simply in view of the fact that, like in the Apology, we see that Socrates is aware of his own ignorance, and in so being aware of his own ignorance is in a greater state to come to knowledge than is the sophist Gorgias here. So there's sort of Socratic irony, and immediately, as Plato is apt to do in most of his dialogues, he immediately draws this symbolic distinction between Thessaly and Athens, between Gorgias and Socrates, between ignorance and knowledge, in between wisdom and folly, really. So, but you can see that, and so Socrates then says, well, we first got to get clear about what virtue itself is, but in Socrates here, I sort of love it, really. He says, forget Gorgias, don't give me the explanations that Gorgias gives. Let's actually look for yourself, Meno. I'll look for myself. Let's see if we can come to knowledge. So this is important too, because there's a sort of methodological element implicit within the Meno, which consists in the idea that knowledge is something that it consists in the idea that knowledge is something that should be demonstrable, demonstratable, and that we shouldn't rely on arguments of authority in this matter, right? And then in general, it's bad philosophical practice to rely on arguments of authority. We'll see this is somewhat problematic because then Socrates will actually give an argument by authority later. But Socrates says, "What's virtue? Forget gorgeous. Think for yourself." And Meno tries, and to Meno's credit, he does give a whole number of examples of virtue. He gives what we might say are particular virtues, right? He lists off that, for instance, you have that a certain type of person has a certain type of virtue. He suggests that men have a certain type of virtue, women have a certain type of virtue, children have a certain type of virtue, and it looks like there's as many virtues as there are different types of people or situations. And so virtue looks very multifarious. Now, Socrates doesn't like this because what Socrates is after is he wants to know what the universal form of virtue is. That is, what is the essence of virtue such that the virtue of a child and the virtue of, let's say, the political leader, right, the virtue of a parent and the virtue of a teacher, all of these different people have virtues, but what is it about all of them such that we call them the same thing, that we call them virtue? You can see in a Platonic methodology, the question here is, can we give an account of the essence of virtue in the form of a definition? So you can see here, there's a strong contrast here between giving a particular example versus giving the universal form. And ultimately, of course, Plato thinks that knowledge consists in the universal form, not in the particular description or example that one can give. This raises an interesting question for us, which is namely, is the essence of virtue pluralistic or monistic? That is, could it be the case that there's multiple types of virtues, and that's just the way it is, or does all virtue have to actually coherently solidify under one description or explanation? And you might call that a monistic approach. Plato doesn't actually use these terms, pluralistic and monistic, so don't think that. But a good analysis here would show that part of the debate concerns whether or not virtue is monistic, or it's one thing, or whether or not it's pluralistic, many things. We'll see in the course of the dialogue, ultimately they're going to argue it's monistic. Socrates always defends the idea that it's monistic, but Meno seems to, at a variety of points, defend or lean towards the idea that it's pluralistic, though in the end he seems to consent with Socrates that it is monistic. So that's sort of the first thing. So Meno seems to suggest no, Socrates says no. Interestingly enough, the question of, for instance, can virtue be gendered emerges. And I thought this is sort of interesting because today in 21st century, in the 21st century world, the question of gendered language and the gender in general has become a very sort of interesting question with a lot of research, a lot of people paying close attention to these questions. So it's interesting here that Plato precedes us by, a couple millennia here by asking the question whether or not virtue is gendered. That is there a separate virtue for men than there is for women? Plato in the name or in the voice of Socrates, will argue strongly against the idea that virtue is gendered, or that there's a difference between the virtues of the genders. So that's sort of an interesting question here, and so I thought it worth mentioning because I know that a number of you are probably interested in this question, and so it might be worth your time to consider Plato's argument in this regard, and also take a look at how leading feminists and gender theorists approach this issue, where today I think there's a lot of people who argue that the virtue is gendered. For instance, there's a domain of philosophy and contemporary feminist philosophy known as the ethics of care, which seems to argue that. So it's an interesting question and it's worth considering. Of course, Socrates rejects it because he doesn't think that that can't get to the essence of what virtue is. So, so Meno, once he sort of is beginning to understand what sort of explanation Socrates is after, he gives another potential definition for what justice is. He says, well, what else is virtue but to be able to rule over people if you're seeking one description to fit them all? So you can see here that Meno understands that he wants a monistic explanation, and so he suggests that virtues maybe has something to do with ruling over people. And Socrates, of course, inquires about this, and Meno clarifies that, well, maybe justice is virtue, because ruling, when you rule over people, to rule well, virtuously, is to rule justly. So maybe justice is a type of virtue. But Socrates isn't convinced, actually, that Meno understands what they're doing methodologically. And he makes a distinction. He says, well, okay, Meno, if justice is virtue, do you mean that it is virtue, or do you mean that it is a virtue, right? And here you can see that he wants to know, is justice identical, isomorphic with virtue, or is justice a characteristic, an attribute, or have some other relationship to virtue? Of course, and so you can see here that they have to sort of clarify this. An epistemological point, and it has to do with the theory of knowledge. And you can see here, this is where Plato's discussion of knowledge is beginning to get generated out of this question and discussion of virtue. Because Socrates is pursuing the essence of a thing, and he wants to do so by determining what its definition is. And he wants to proceed by a method. What I have here is he proceeds through a method of refutation, a method of proceeding by refutation. That is, what Socrates suggests is that in order to answer these questions, that they should give a definition and then take a look at that definition, see if that definition can be refuted, and refuted through some form of contradiction. If it can't be refuted, Socrates suggests that we should accept the definition. And he actually gives this example of an essential definition in the terms of shape and color. And he sort of asks, what is color? You can't answer that question by pointing to different colors or saying green and red and blue. You have to give something else, something that would cover all the descriptions. And so he says, for instance, so color is just a characteristic. Maybe the essence of it is what follows its shape, or something like this. So he gives this sort of phenomenological definition of color. And then they proceed by seeing if they can refute it. Now, they're not interested in colors or shapes, but Socrates, again here, and Plato by caveat, is giving you an example of the sort of method he's after. Now, this is something important we have to mention, is it means that Plato is committed to what I call a coherency of truth theory. That is, if something is coherent and consistent, i.e. it cannot be refuted, Plato will argue that that thing, that proposition, must therefore be true. So that's this idea that truth is coherent, and that which is not true is incoherent. And so that means this is a form of rationalism, where sheerly through an analysis of arguments, we can come to knowledge of something. We can come to true knowledge based upon coherence and refutation. There's a lot of people who are thinking about this issue, and I mean contemporary philosophers, who are looking at this question of coherency. It seems to me, and this is my own criticism here, is that that doesn't seem to me to be a very good basis for knowledge, right? It seems to me that I can have lots of coherent explanations that are not refutable, but are in fact false, right? Because it seems to me you could have different types of descriptions about things. It's an interesting question here, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe Plato's right, you should probably trust Plato over me, but you should consider that. Is it possible to have a coherent set of explanations that are not refuted, that are not contradictory, but yet still false? Plato doesn't think so. I think I beg to differ myself. So, but anyway, after that's sort of stated here, so Meno then says, okay, well, Socrates, I think that virtue is as the poets say. It's to find joy in the beautiful things and to have power. Okay, so now we see here, and this is an important element within this forecasting the eventual theory of the forms, which is namely the idea here that virtue, that there's something, knowledge and virtue have something to do with beauty, right? And so the problem is, we'll see, is that Meno has chosen a poet who later on contradicts himself. And Socrates will actually point that out. So maybe it's not a good idea to trust the poets, which Plato recommends that we do not, actually. Now, we'll get into that in a different video. So, but they go through a discussion, right? First thing here is that people desire good things. It looks like everyone, there's a discussion here, is there are clearly good and bad people in the world, but do bad people desire good things or bad things? Right? Well, how do we define what's good and bad? We can say that good things are things that are beneficial, and bad things are things that are harmful, right? And that seems to be a pretty good description, because, of course, we can give examples of bad people who have beneficial things, but if someone has something that's bad, it seems to always be harmful in some way or another, right? There's different types of harm, but it seems like harm is something implicitly related to what we conceive of as bad, and what's good seems to be beneficial. So, and of course we know that the virtuous person is the person who's good, and so we can say that the virtuous person, therefore, must have a high capacity to attain things that are good, right? The virtuous person, in virtue of their virtue, is able to get more good things, hopefully, than bad things, right? And that is more things that are beneficial. So do people desire bad things? No. Ultimately, Plato is committed to the idea that when people desire things that are bad, what they're actually doing is they're desiring things that they think are good out of ignorance. But he thinks that all people actually aim for what's good, right? But attaining good things, and this is an important feature, is not necessarily virtuous in itself. So consider, for instance, consider forms of wealth. People can get wealth in a whole bunch of different ways, right? And that wealth can be beneficial, right? But simply because it's beneficial doesn't mean that it was attained through virtue necessarily, right? So consider, for instance, the gangster, right? The gangster who extorts money from other people, right? So the gangster gets wealth, and the gangster benefits from the wealth, but the gangster has not achieved that through virtue. So that means, then, that the acquisition of virtue must be accompanied by justice or moderation or piety or some other part of virtue. If it's not, it won't be virtue, even though it provides good things. So just getting good things isn't enough. You have to acquire things through virtue. And that means that the acquisition of virtue must be accompanied by virtue. You can see here that Plato is trying to clarify this suggestion that Meno has made in terms of the relationship between justice. So that's one of the things that's implicit, or that's sort of an element within this Socratic dialectical method, is Socrates is still playing around with and trying to coordinate and organize these suggestions that they're discussing. So justice and virtue are still at play. Now, if that didn't make sense or you're confused, well, guess what? You're in company with others here. Meno actually responds, but I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about anymore. I'm totally perplexed. And in fact, Meno says, you seem in appearance and in every way to be like a torpedo fish. Here's what they look like. For it, too, makes anyone who comes close and touches it feel numb. You can get stung by a stingray, right? Or stung by a torpedo fish. And then you'll be paralyzed or numb. And he says, I have no answer to give you, Socrates, yet I have made many speeches about virtue before a large audience on 1,000 occasions. Very good speeches, as I thought, but now I cannot even say what virtue is. So Meno's like, wait a second, I'm not exactly sure what we're talking about. I don't understand exactly what virtue is anymore. And I feel like you've stung me like a torpedo fish, which is a reference that comes, that in more than one dialogue is made about Socrates, is that as soon as people would begin to talk about Socrates, subjects that they thought they knew, they suddenly realized they didn't know or were ignorant of. But here's what Socrates says. He says, listen, the perplexity you feel pales in comparison to the perplexity I feel. That is, I'm more perplexed than anyone when I cause perplexity in others. And so I think there's something interesting here worth mentioning is there seems to be two types of perplexity, and there's debate about this regarding the Socratic irony implicit within the whole thing, but it looks like we can differentiate, I want to argue, between authentic perplexity, that is being perplexed because one doesn't understand, versus rhetorical perplexity, acting as if you're perplexing, or rhetorical perplexity would be trying to make others perplexed so that you can win the argument. And of course, we looked in the Gorgias here, the argument against rhetoric, and so I don't think that we should interpret Socrates here as producing perplexity in order to show people that they were dumb. Rather, I think we should interpret Socrates as having a form of authentic perplexity, namely that he really didn't know. And we'll see this notion of the perplexity comes out quickly a little bit later in the dialogue. Now, after this discussion emerges regarding, or after this sort of quick interlude about the torpedo fish and perplexity, this question about knowledge is raised by Meno. Meno says, well, how will you look for it, Socrates? That is, how do you look for knowledge about virtue when you don't know at all what it is you're looking for? How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? If you should meet with it, how will you know that these are the things that you did not know, right? It's sort of like looking for your lost keys. How can you find your lost keys if they're lost, yet we know that there's places to look for when they're lost? So in a sort of similar vein, it's this paradox regarding knowledge. And so, for instance, Alvin Silverman, he's a contributor to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, articulates this as a Platonic paradox regarding knowledge. And we can formalize it thus, where you can say for anything F, either one knows F or one does not know F. If one knows F, then one cannot inquire about F. And if one does not know F, then one cannot inquire about F. Therefore, for all F, one cannot inquire about F. Right? So it leads to this paradox of knowledge, which is namely, if we know that we need to inquire about something, that means we already know it, which means we don't need to inquire about it. Right? And if we don't know about it, then we can't inquire about it, which means how is it that we know that we don't know? Right? You may have to pause that and rewind that and re-listen to it, but this is the paradox of knowledge that's brought up within the Meno dialogue, and it's a really important paradox. Now, what is the solution? And here's where Socrates suggests a solution that is very clever, yet I think requires a lot of analysis and skepticism about. Plato's solution to the paradox is actually to rework and redefine what it is knowledge consists in, what it is we think knowledge is. And what we see here, interestingly enough, is that Plato uses an argument from divine authority. Socrates says, well, I don't know, but I've heard it from this priest, from this person who has access to the divine, that the knowledge is recollection. Knowledge is a form of remembering. Now, there's interesting ways to interpret this. Why would Plato use an argument from authority here? Why not just give a demonstrable argument? Either Plato has done this on purpose, or Plato himself wasn't sure how to give the argument. The other thing here is that Plato may also be associating, and I think this is likely, associating the idea of divinity. Now, clearly Plato also has a number of, all throughout Plato's work is a discussion about religion, as well as a critique about religion and theology. So there's a lot of things going on here that we're not going to pay too much attention to, because it's not exactly altogether clear how we ought to interpret this. But it's interesting, I sort of call it revelation, where here Socrates seems to suggest that at some point knowledge is given to us from without, right? Somehow knowledge, there has to be a beginning point, and we can't, and in this case the beginning point, he sort of uses this trope of I've heard it, that. So it's interesting. Now, what is the argument, generally speaking? Well, if we're going to rework what knowledge means, he says, let's think about it in terms of the soul. He says, the soul is immortal, that's what I've heard. And to say it's immortal means that the soul is reborn, and it has been reborn many times. Which means that you're sitting here now watching this, but your soul previously had other lives, right? So it's not the same thing as the form of reincarnation we see in Hinduism, but it is fairly close. And there is a strong resemblance here. So let's assume this is the case. If the soul is immortal, then it's been born many times, which means that the soul already has knowledge of things. Now, I put all things here. Actually, in the dialogue, it says, Socrates asked the question in the negative. He says, if the soul has been born many times, is there nothing that the soul does not know? Meno agrees. So it looks like here the suggestion is that the knowledge is already within us, right? Knowledge is not something that is discovered. Rather, knowledge is something that is brought forth out of someone. It is something that is remembered, or at least it's analogous to something that is remembered. And there's an interesting point here that I just want to mention here, which is namely, there's a discussion quickly about the psychology of argumentation, at least Socrates suggested. Socrates suggests that some of the arguments, like you find in the Sophist, they leave you feeling faint-hearted. And for instance, the debater's argument, the idea that you can't gain knowledge, is one of these types of arguments. It's easy to want to just throw up your hands and give up, and say that knowledge is impossible, and to become cynical. But Socrates suggests that there's other arguments which are energetic in their effect. They actually propel us to gain knowledge. And so Socrates is also, I think we can see this differentiation between faint-heartedness and that which is energetic as aligned with that earlier juxtaposition we saw between Athens and Thessaly, between the sophist and philosophers, between Meno, or at least Gorgias, and Socrates. So you see that same framework, dualistic framework, being developed here when he talks about what I would call the psychology of argumentation, how arguments affect a person. And it certainly seems true, right? All of us, all of us who've been doing philosophy long enough have encountered arguments that actually caused us to quake a little bit and to sort of shift in our seat and become worried and skeptical and cynical. And all of us have also had arguments that seem to propel us towards feeling that we gain knowledge, right? So learning is recollection. And so if learning is recollection, then what we've done with the debater's argument is we've denied the premise that we were actually ever truly ignorant. And so if we can deny the ignorance premise, then the debater's paradox isn't a problem. But what's so beautiful about this Meno dialogue is that then Socrates goes one step further. And instead of just suggesting that this is the case, he actually tries to demonstrate that it's the case. And he does so by showing how, by what's known as, the Meno's slave boy example, in which you can take someone who's totally ignorant of mathematics, and sheerly through questioning and asking them questions, they too can actually discover geometric argumentative proofs. That is, he gives a demonstration of someone who actually goes from ignorance to knowledge. So he calls over one of the attendants, or one of the slaves, and it's this boy who doesn't have any education. He, of course, knows a little bit. He's heard about squares. He knows what a square is. He knows what a triangle is, but he's never learned any formal geometry. One of the things I encourage you to do is pause this video, or at least after this video, go find someone and see if you can produce the same sort of effect. So what is it? Without previous knowledge, Socrates draws one square in the sand, if you will, and he draws a little square here, and then he asks the boy whether or not it's possible to produce a square that's double the size of the original square. And the boy says, well, I don't see why not. If you're going to double it, what you need to do, and I'm paraphrasing quickly, so this all occurs through question and answer. Socrates asks the question, he never gives the answers. The answers are only given by the slave boy. And most of them are binary questions, yes or no questions. But I'll sort of encapsulate it and paraphrase it a little bit briefer. He says, can we double the size of the square? And the boy says, sure, yeah, I don't see why not. He says, well, how could you do that and know that you've done it? And of course, they discuss the idea that, well, every square has a length. Well, what if you double the lengths? If you double the length of the square, then you should get double the size of the square, right? And so they draw it out, right? So if here's the length, let's double it. And since it's a square, it has the same length on each side. So we'll not only double this, we'll also double this side. But you can see then we end up with this square. But after questioning the boy recognizes that he's wrong. That even though they doubled the length of the sides, they quadrupled the size of the square. Because you can see here is, look, here's the original square, but now there's 4 of them. So this square is actually 4 times the length. And so the boy makes a mistake, but importantly, the boy, through Socrates' questions, recognizes that he's made a mistake. And so then Socrates continues to engage him, and eventually gets him to see, okay, well, what about this? What if you took one of these squares and you dissected it on the diagonal? The boy knows what a diagonal is. He says, okay, well, if you cut it on the diagonal here, right, you can see here that the square, the diagonal separates one half from the other half, right? So you'd split the square into roughly 2 triangles, or rather, this triangle is half the length of the overall square, right? And then you can see here and say, well, wait a second, we've drawn this bigger square. What if we draw diagonals on all 4 of these? And the boy comes up with this all on his own. And you can see here is that, well, wait a second. If this is half the square, then that means that this sort of larger triangle would be the size of the full square. And if you doubled that, then that would be double the size of the square. So you can see here what we have here in the red square. This is actually double the length of the original square rather than quadrupled. And the boy comes to this all on his own despite making mistakes. So it's not easy for the boy, but the boy eventually comes to knowledge. And in fact, the boy actually is able to articulate this as a mathematical proof. And you can see here there's a movement from ignorance to knowledge. And Socrates suggests that it's not that we never told the boy the answer. All we did was ask questions. The boy came up with it on his own. That is, he came up with it without, he found the solution, the proof, by introspectively analyzing ideas that are or were his own. And as a result, this reveals that knowledge, mathematical knowledge, actually has something to it which is innate, something which is inborn within us. I sort of call this the torpedo fish effect, 84C, which is namely the idea is that even though the boy, certainly when he was making mistakes, probably felt the same type of perplexity that Socrates mentioned earlier, right? The boy didn't know and was confused, but eventually that confusion led the boy into clarity, right? And so maybe there's an effect of the torpedo fish, which is namely the numbness one feels from these questions can propel us in an energetic sense to gain knowledge. Now, what does this mean? Well, it also means that Socrates is arguing that dialectical investigation, and actually Plato is arguing, that dialectical investigation leads to knowledge and clarity. So we can move from not knowing into knowing. And this is quite mysterious. Consider when you have a conversation, a long conversation with someone, and as you're having the conversation, you move, you transition from not knowing something to knowing something. It's so quite mysterious because what gets added? No one tells you the answer, and yet you arrive and you, more importantly, recognize the answer. How is it that you recognize the answer as the right answer? It must be something innate. So finding knowledge within oneself is what he means by recollection. So if you're not happy with this language of recollection, in the Meno, recollection means finding it within yourself. And since the soul is immortal, you're finding it from, I guess, a pre-life or some sort of pre-state of existence. So all in all, this means we should reject the debater's argument. Okay, so then the dialogue, after discussing this question of knowledge, jumps back to virtue, and Meno is sort of like, well, okay, but what about virtue again? I wanted to know whether or not virtue was teachable. And Socrates says, well, we need to use a hypothetical investigation. Let's think about what could be the case, and if it were the case, what would follow? And maybe we can use that to figure out what to refute and what can't be refuted. We'll accept what can't be refuted. And he said he sort of breaks it down into a series of questions that have to be answered. For one, if among the things existing in the soul, virtue has a certain quality, is that quality teachable? Can it be recollected? And if it's not knowledge, that is, if virtue is not a type of knowledge, can it be taught? Because it looks like only knowledge can be taught. But remember, to teach knowledge is actually to help a person remember, right? Because of the recollection theory. And of course, is it the case that people cannot be taught anything but knowledge? Right? Oops, sorry, there's a little spelling error, right? So Socrates breaks this down into these sort of 4 questions that need to be answered. And then after that, they move into the question, okay, well, let's think about what virtue is. We've talked about this. Virtue's good. It's beneficial, right? And in this case, it looks like virtue is a type of knowledge, right? Because not everything, right? Virtue is good and it's beneficial. The example here is health. If you have knowledge about how to be healthy, then you'll get the benefit of being health. But importantly, virtue depends upon the right use, and right use is where the virtue comes in. So for instance, consider the idea that virtue can be different in different ways. Virtue appears situational. So for instance, imagine that if I'm, I don't know, imagine if I'm in a, let's see here. This is sort of an odd example, but let's imagine, for instance, that I'm hiding someone who's innocent from someone who... I'm hiding an innocent person from a criminal who wants to injure that innocent person, right? Let's say this person comes to my door and knocks on the door and asks me, are you hiding this person? I want to kill them. In this case, it seems like since they're innocent, lying would be the virtuous thing to do. But you can see here that lying is not always virtuous. In fact, most of the time, lying is not virtuous, but vicious. It's an evil or it's a bad thing. So you can see here is that the benefit from virtue doesn't occur from doing any specific thing, but it occurs from doing the right thing at the right time. That is, it looks like virtue consists in the right use of things. So because of this, the right use of things is where the benefit of virtue comes in, right? So I am virtuous and I have a certain sort of knowledge. I'm going backwards here. So that means virtuous has to consist in understanding things, because the only way I can have the right use of things is if I already have knowledge or understanding of those things. So that means that virtue is therefore a type of wisdom. It's a type of knowledge, right? So, okay, here's where Anytus jumps into the equation. And then they say, okay, well, if virtue is a type of knowledge, then it seems like you can teach it. And so they find Anytus, and here's some quick background on Anytus. Anytus is actually one of the Socratic accusers who actually got Socrates executed. So Anytus is actually a bad guy, if you will, within the sort of Platonic dialogues. And so Plato is raising here a sort of ironic case of someone who is not virtuous, but they're inquiring with that person about virtue. So there's some sort of interesting ironies that are going on here. Anytus was actually a successful general. When I say successful, he was a general, and in some cases he won. In other cases he lost. And in fact, he was charged with treason. Everyone who was charged with treason survived except for him because he bribed the jury. He led the charge against the 30 tyrants. He was actually a leader and a defender of Athenian democracy. And also, interestingly enough, Anytus' son was one of the followers of Socrates, which probably led to why it is Anytus accused him of corrupting the youth. Also, Anytus and Alcibiades have an interesting relationship. Here, Alcibiades was a follower of Socrates and also a good friend of Socrates, but Alcibiades actually did eventually commit treason against the Athenians, and actually, so Alcibiades is also a complex figure within Athenian history, and it's although unsubstantiated, folklore has it or whatnot that that Anytus was banished from Athens after Socrates was executed, though there's no definitive evidence for that. But that's a little bit about who Anytus is. So suddenly they're talking to Anytus, and they ask Anytus whether or not virtue can be taught. Now Anytus jumps in, and he's actually immediately argues against the sophist. He doesn't like the sophist, which is interesting, and so he doesn't agree with anything the sophists have. But they begin to discuss with Anytus whether or not virtue can be taught. And they give examples of key figures within Athenian history. Pericles is the only example I'll mention here. Pericles, of course, is known as the most famous leader of Athens in its golden age. But famously, Pericles had two sons, one of whom was named Xenophon. But Pericles has two sons who famously were not virtuous and were not good statesmen, despite the fact that their father was a good statesman. But Pericles was known for trying to teach his sons everything he could. So the idea here, as Socrates suggests, is that, well, Pericles taught, he's like the most virtuous person and statesman in Athenian history, and he actually did try to teach his children all the things he could. And he asked Anytus, Anytus, don't you think that if Pericles could, he would have taught virtue to his children? Anytus agrees. But Pericles was unable to teach virtue, which reveals that maybe virtue can't be taught, right? Because it looks like in most cases, people who are virtuous are actually unable to teach virtue to other people or to their own children. And so it's interesting here because it seems to be the case. All of us can probably even think of examples within our own lives or within our own contemporary history of people who are very good people who did amazing things, but their children were not as amazing as them. And so it looks like, and especially in the case of virtue, that it can't be taught, because why wouldn't you teach virtue if it's the source of the benefits for getting good things in life and for happiness as such, right? And for instance, they mentioned that the sophists seem to teach virtue. They seem to teach virtue, but the problem is that the sophists argue contradictory propositions. They hold all sorts of things, and they argue them rhetorically like the poets. But they don't actually seem to have clear knowledge about virtue. So that means that they don't have understanding about virtue. And if they don't have this understanding, they can't be teachers of virtue, because without knowledge, how can you teach virtue? So it looks like there are no good teachers of virtue, and there's no pupils. We should say here, though, it looks like there's none, because ultimately we'll see here that Plato suggests that maybe Socrates is teaching virtue, and he does this ironically. But before we get that, an important distinction occurs, and this is the distinction between true opinion versus knowledge. So let's imagine, for instance, that I give you a recipe to make a souffle. I've made the souffle, and it is a good souffle, and this recipe is a good recipe. I actually have knowledge of the recipe and that it's a good recipe because I've experienced it. But let's say when I give you the recipe for the souffle, it is a good recipe, but you've never made it, which means that you don't have knowledge that the recipe is a good recipe, but you might hold the true opinion that it is a good recipe. So if we compare these two cases, the person who has knowledge from the person who has a true opinion, we can see that the benefit is not, or the usefulness of the opinion or the knowledge isn't what's at stake, right? That's not what seems to demarcate knowledge and true opinion, because you can use the recipe and get a good souffle, you'll get the good benefit even though you don't have the knowledge, and vice versa. So what's the difference here? Well, first, Socrates suggests here in his discussion with Meno that true opinion is something that's fleeting, it's unstable. It's like, he says you have to hold it down like a deadless statue. A deadless statue is a statue that would come alive, and so the Greeks would, when they carved the statues, they would carve bonds and straps to hold down the statue so that at night when it came alive it wouldn't run away. And true opinions are like that, because to have a true opinion is to have something that's right, but to not understand why it's right. That is, you can't actually apply that true opinion to doing other things. So for instance, you may have the recipe, and if you follow the recipe for the souffle exactly, you'll get a good souffle. But the problem is you don't know how to make a good souffle otherwise and on your own. Whereas the person who has knowledge can, right? So that means that the knowledge, a person who has knowledge has something that is more stable. And what is knowledge consist in? Well, it seems to consist in the idea that someone can give an account. That is, they can answer the question, why? Right? So I can tell you why it's a good souffle, but you can't tell me why it's a good souffle. So knowledge includes an account that allows one to be right in all cases that regard that thing. And this is really a sort of important piece that will come out later on in the dialogues, especially because it's related to, it would be related to this question of, well, how is knowledge gained? It looks like knowledge is gained through the development of an account. But this gets problematized later, and so we'll talk about that later throughout. And so, but this distinction between true opinion and knowledge is really an important distinction. And it also helps reveal how it is, you might say, that people go from ignorance into knowledge. It looks like people can have ignorance where they're ignorant and they don't know anything, but they can also have ignorance where they have a true opinion, but they're ignorant of the account. And then knowledge is when you have, you actually have true opinion with an account. It looks like this is the case. This is a huge debate, though. So, but what's interesting, though, is although reaching this sort of conclusion, the dialogue suddenly sort of abruptly ends, in which here we say, okay, so virtue cannot be taught, because that's what we sort of learn with the Pericles example, then it must not be a sort of knowledge. So what exactly is virtue? And it's interesting here because Plato ends the dialogue in a point of where I think he actually develops what you might say is a true opinion, but he doesn't demonstrably give us the account for what virtue is. So what is virtue? Well, we get this sort of in the end. Virtue would be neither an inborn quality nor taught, but come to those who possess it as a gift from the gods, which is not accompanied by understanding, unless there is someone among our statesmen who can make another into a statesman. If there were one, he could be said to be among the living as Homer said Theseus was among the dead, namely that he alone retained his wits, while the others flitted about like shadows. In the same manner such a man would, as far as virtue is contained, here also be the only true reality, compared as it were with shadows. Now, later on when we look at Plato's Republic, we're going to be looking at his allegory of the cave, and we're going to see here that Plato isn't at the end of the dialogue just saying, well, it's a divine gift, we'll never know what virtue is. But you can see here there's a reason that scholars hold that this dialogue is a transitional dialogue. Because Plato is really sort of alluding to Socrates eventually, and he's alluding to this allegory of the cave we find in the Republic, where he's going to say that as you move from ignorance into knowledge, it's like moving from shadows into the light. And ultimately, Plato identifies Socrates as the person who could do this. And he did it through this dialectical method. And we can see here there's something, Plato's associating it here with the divine. It has to do with the theory of the soul and all these other sorts of things. But I think it would be wrong to say that Plato's suggesting that you can't gain knowledge about virtue. But what I think he's saying is he's alluding to the development of the dialectic, to the idea that we have to develop even further the framework by which we're asking these questions. And so the Meno dialogue is insufficient dialectically, but it propels us forward. And we see an illusion of it here too. And I think ultimately a sort of ironic movement in which Plato is aligning the virtuous teacher as Socrates. And so there's something very interesting here. So we don't get a formal answer to the question ultimately, except we're told that virtue is not teachable. What is it? Not sure. How, if it is taught, not sure how. So this dialogue really ends without resolution, but it does seem to address this notion that there is such a thing as gaining knowledge, and it seems to occur through an activity within the soul. So we're going to conclude our video here. It's exactly an hour. Thank you for watching this video. I'll see you guys online.